Hi, everyone. Welcome, everyone who are here in person, and also welcome everyone who are joining us online. My name is Lily Wong. I'm the new assistant professor here at the School of Architecture. It's great to have everyone here tonight. Before we start, I just wanted to mention a few logistical items. So this semester's Tecnoglass lecture series is titled Architecture and Vegetal Life. It aims to explore how designing for and with vegetal life can inform new research methods and design processes, how it may challenge assumptions about architecture and landscape design, and how planting can be a form of empowerment. Just a small note, if anyone online or in person would like AIA continuing education credits, please email Shauna Meyer. All right. Now let me talk more about what's going to happen this evening. So after Sarah's talk, two of our professors will join us for a conversation. Tonight we have the privilege of having Professors Rocco and Gabriel Soomar. Rocco is an architect and scholar whose practice focuses on the unique relationship between architecture and landscape found in the American tropics. Rocco is super knowledgeable about landscape design and ecologies in South Florida. So I'm really glad that he can join us today and be part of the conversation. Gabriel Soomar is a transdisciplinary designer whose practice synthesizes emergent media, storytelling, and culture to shape collective imagination. Fun fact, it's actually an honor. Gabriel is actually a graduate of the school, the University of Miami, and he also completed his Master of Design Studies and Master of Architecture from Harvard GSD before he comes back to Miami. So thank you both of you for joining us for the conversation tonight. Now let me introduce our speaker, Sara Zewde. Sara is a landscape architect with experience designing a range of landscapes across the Americas. Her practice, Studio Zewde, works explicitly to illuminate the distinct cultural and ecological qualities of a place. Sara has received numerous awards and accolades, just to name a few along her very long list of accomplishments. She was named the 2024 Time Magazine 100 Next and Wallpaper Magazine's 300 People Shaping Creative America. She was a United States Artist Fellow in 2020 and an artist in residence at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation in Florida in 2016. In addition to her practice, Sara is also assistant professor of practice at Harvard GSD. And this is really a privilege for you to come here and talk with us among your really busy schedule, Sara. So we just can't wait to see your work now. So please join us on the stage and please welcome Sara tonight.
Thank you. How's everybody doing? Hello. I'm guessing that means you're doing well. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you all this evening. Let's get into it. So I grew up not so far from here, I guess, in the wider sense of place. I am from the Gulf Coast. Gulf of Mexico. And I grew up in Louisiana and Texas. And I watched this storm event brew and barrel towards my home state while I was a student in college. I was undeclared. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And in the aftermath of the storm, I started to really research different disciplinary frameworks looking for ways to understand Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath, and searching for ways and skill sets to intervene in the factors that can manifest it. Since then, in my journey towards landscape architecture, I'll just share a few of the kind of key tenets of the practice that I am continuing to evolve since that storm event. Toni Morrison's work on memory and identity really shape how I think about ecology. The title of this talk is Ecologies of Memory. And she talks about flooding and how flooding is, she kind of reframes flooding as remembering. She talks about how water has perfect memory. It always returns to where it once was. And so ecology, in the way that I see it, is a cultural construct as much as it is anything else. And that as landscape architects, we possess a particular skill set that allows us to think about ecologies in a cultural context as well as a physical one. Sharifa Rhodes Pitts is an author who's written this book, Harlem is Nowhere. And she, in the book, she kind of repositions this phrase that has been referenced over time about Harlem. This idea that Harlem is both a real place and an idea. And for me, that also permeates in my work and in my thinking, that every place is an idea as much as it is a real place. And what is the idea of a particular place? And the late Bell Hooks writes about a notion of the aesthetic of being. And her writing about this really resonates with my own trajectory in this field. She talks about how design was never a word that she heard in her house growing up, but there were ways in which lifeways were constructed in her family life, in her home life, and in her community. And that there is a kind of aesthetic of being, and acknowledging that, understanding that, and challenging and widening our methods of design to understand the aesthetics of being in a particular place, and then designing in a way that amplifies or affirms those aesthetics of being are an objective of my practice. And so I practice, I research, teach, there are all these kinds of activities that I'm engaged in. And for me, they're not parallel, endeavors. They really are formed together around those central inquiries. And, big portion of that is my practice of landscape architecture. And the way that we think about this in the studio is we talk about our design methodology as syncing site interpretation with cultural narrative and a dedication to the craft of construction. And that is to say that, we have all these big ideas about that help us frame a narrative around a project, but those aren't just nice words to say. They actually, we really use them to, design every detail of construction. And so the idea is really that we're always referring to that narrative for every decision that we make. We don't have a details library, for instance, in the office. Everything is quite bespoke, and we think about materials, how they're expressed, how they come together, and ways in which they either reaffirm that cultural narrative or not. And ultimately, that means a place in its physical expression either makes, it can make a place feel like it belongs in its context, and ultimately then people feel like they belong in the place. And so with this methodology, we work at a really kind of wide range of scales and project types and geographies. And that's really important to me too, to have a diversity in our portfolio so that we're always growing and challenging our design muscle and this methodology. I'm really proud of the team that we have. People bring a really wide range of academic and professional backgrounds to the project of landscape architecture in our office. So, we have a soil scientist, we have folks from the construction industry, folks from architecture, lighting design, we have a textile designer. And, for me, I think of it in the following way, we were all indigenous people at some point crafting our lifeways in the landscape, and at some point that got severed for everybody. And this tiny profession of landscape architecture positions itself in that gap. And so I want landscape architecture to be an expansive field that is bolstered and fed by a wide range of ways of thinking and knowing and making, as it once was. Just some vibe photos from the office. And I'll share 4 projects with you that kind of span across time, engage the premise of the lecture series, and kind of a range of scales as well. So you'll get a sense of the trajectory of the practice, but ways in which we're kind of continuing to circle around this idea of ecologies of memory. The first is a project in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, that I started working on 15 years ago. This is the Valongo Wharf in a neighborhood called Pequena Africa. 22% of all Africans trafficked to the Americas passed through Rio de Janeiro. And many of them actually, the first place their feet touched the Americas would be at the Valongo Wharf. And this is a painting from 1835 of the site of landing. It was this kind of wooden jetty until some investors decided to upgrade it into a stone jetty as the slave market increased. This is an image from the bay in 1888, the year that slavery was abolished, but you get a sense of the scale of industry in the port at the time. So this is a map that kind of shows the contemporary coastline out here relative to the historic coastline here. And this green area right there is the stone jetty. What collapsing the 2 maps on top of each other reveals is essentially following the abolition of slavery, there were a series of landfilling operations that removed on top of the old slave wharf, and it removed the wharf from sight until the Olympics and the World Cup in 2014 and 2016, which spurred a lot of construction in this historic core and revealed the stone jetty perfectly preserved 6 feet below the street. So I was invited to take part in the project of, well, I should say the city had no plans to develop a memorial or anything here because they didn't know they'd find it necessarily. But activists really fought to prompt the city to come up with a plan. And so I was invited to take a part in that. And in entering into this project, I kind of took stock of what the architecture of memorials is. And so this is kind of a timeline graphic summarizing that. And, the main takeaway here is that the way we think about memorials is really rooted in notions of monumentality, stemming from classical antiquity. And although the form changes over time, over the course of architecture, the use of space doesn't change. The kind of regulation of the body, the idea of slowness and guilt, and while the forms become abstracted and perhaps even on the ground plane, essentially the spatial practice in and around them are the same. And that is a demonstration of power, ultimately. And so, even many of the existing memorials to slavery co-opt this form. And despite the fact that these forms they really treat history as, kind of moments in time or discrete moments in time, or, a battle, a war, a tragedy, a triumph, a hero. But slavery was not an event. It was 400 years of the way the world operated, and its effects are still present today. And that would suggest a different architectural language. And so the project for me became about searching for that new language. So I started by mapping the site over 300 million years. And what you see is at that black dot is where the Valongo Wharf is or was. And so what you see is that the site actually touched the southwest coast of Africa 300 million years ago. And that red shape is the laticolic tropical red soil region. And so even today, the soil profile of this part of Brazil and portions of Africa are very similar. So if we zoom in on that dot, what you'll see here is the ethnic groups on the continent of Africa where many of the Europeans traveled to traffic people from, mostly along water bodies. You also see in the gray lines are the dominant slave trading routes. And you also see the dominant ocean vectors. Here in the Americas, those hatches represent different traditions as they relate to plants. So many of the Africans that were trafficked to the Americas actually brought seeds with them, not knowing where they were headed. But a lot of these plants are really central to their cosmology. And those plants ended up hybridizing and flourishing in the Americas. And so many of those cultures and traditions have been resilient and hybridized and flourished in their own way across these soil types. And you see Florida implicated in this system as well. Those ocean currents mean that many of the seeds made the same trip as the Africans, but actually arrived in the Americas before the start of the slave trade. And so when the Africans arrived and saw some of those plants, especially the coastal plants, it's said that they knew that their gods were present. So if we zoom in again on this dot, the Valongo Wharf here, this is essentially a visualization of what they would have seen arriving in the wharf. So there's the stone jetty. There's a series of warehouses. So essentially you'd be, upon arrival, if you were dead on arrival, you'd be taken down the street and thrown in this open burial ground. If you were sick on arrival, you'd be taken to the slave hospital where they would try to make you better before your point of sale to get a better price for you. Or you could go down this central road. Well, if you were able to get free, you'd probably form a free community on the hilltops called a quilombo. Or you'd be taken down this central corridor to this triangular plaza where you'd be fattened and tamed for about 2 to 4 weeks before you were sold. And these warehouses that line the streets are essentially where you were warehoused in that period of time, until you'd be taken to one of the many plazas sprinkled around the neighborhood where the sales would actually happen. So I took that visualization and mapped it onto the contemporary city and found that many of those plazas, those buildings, those streets, the burial grounds, they're all present in the contemporary city with no marker of their implication in it. And so I then mapped that onto the city-owned parcels in the neighborhood, and I came back to the city, and they wanted a memorial, they wanted a wall with names or something, and so when I showed them this, I said, this is the memorial. The city is the memorial, and proposed a kind of memory plan for the entire neighborhood. This is a practice I was doing of kind of notation to document all the ways in which, while the built environment wasn't telling these stories, that people in their various kind of rituals are actually telling those stories through their own ways of life. So this was the memory plan that I presented to the city, a series of distinct capital projects kind of inserted through the city, tracing that circuit, and finding opportunities in the city-owned parcels to tell that story in those spaces. So that this is a gradual plan, that as these parcels come online, that they could develop this into an entire constellation of memorials. Each one using the plants that Africans brought to the Americas. So I'll just give one example. The ficus genus is a genus that you see here a lot in South Florida, but it's native to both Africa and the Americas as a function of that same history. And in West Africa, they believe that the base of the tree is where the ancestors gather, and in Afro-Brazilian tradition as well. And they mark that with a wrapping of white walls and white fabric at the base. Oh, sorry. And you see this tradition across the diaspora. So this was just a study model that I made of the idea of wrapping and how that might translate into an urban form. So I proposed this kind of circulation system around the archaeological site that was a wrap. So that the archaeological site of the wharf wouldn't just be this kind of cutout box in the middle of the city streets, but it kind of blurred between city and archaeology, between past, present, and future, and wrapped around the base of a grove of ficus trees. We developed a suite of site furnishings, again with this kind of form of the wrap, inscriptions, benches, and planting all integrated, so that memory is not the memorial is not the object that you look at, but it's actually just a part of your everyday life in the way that the history of the legacy of slavery is a part of our everyday lives. A lot of these Afro-Brazilian plants already exist throughout the city as pioneering plants, and so there were these opportunities for insertion of stairs and viewpoints and paths that highlight the presence of those plants and the presence of this legacy. This was a proposal for a streetscape design along the historic street that used to be the coastline. And the idea here was to express that not only did that street touch the coast 150 years ago, but it touched the continent of Africa 150 million years ago. And so the idea was to come up with this paving pattern that represents kind of a zipper graphic with lighting and legible from above, where the descendants of the Quilombos live today. And so, those are a couple of examples, but really that whole constellation of proposals are about an insertion into everyday life all around you. This was the installation of one of the plants that we proposed. This is a baobab tree that they planted right before the start of the Olympics in 2016. This was a proposal to basically reconnect the downtown region to the sea by removing a warehouse that the city owned, activating this new public space, activating a lot of the rituals tied to water in Afro-Brazilian cosmology. And again, kind of creating a microclimate that's needed in the hot heat of Rio de Janeiro in an urban sense, but also, again, kind of braiding memory with everyday life. A little bit closer to home, this is a project called Graffiti Pier in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is Pier 18, which is Graffiti Pier, and Pier 20, which is falling into the Delaware River. And our site was a little bit of the upland area too, about a 6-acre site. So a lot of our projects start with really a kind of a really deep research component, which you'll see across the projects. And so we started this project by learning about the history of the site and of graffiti. Who knows where graffiti was invented? What city? Anyone want to guess? Italy? I haven't heard that one. Not Brazil. It's Philadelphia. They love to tell us New Yorkers this. But yeah, the guy is still alive and he's very well celebrated, and this is a big source of pride for Philadelphia. Essentially what happened was when coal declined in the 1970s, a lot of the infrastructure that fell into disuse became a great place to cultivate street art and an underground graffiti scene. And this site, Pier 18, was a big part of the culture, the growth of the culture of graffiti on the Eastern Seaboard. And it remained really an important part of that culture until 2010, when Instagram happened. And what happened with Instagram was that it actually elevated the presence of this site. It became the most Instagram spot in Philadelphia. And it grew from this underground scene to becoming, a place where hundreds of people were coming every day. And this became a liability for Conrail, who owns the site. And so they started to engage our client, the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation, on the idea of hiring landscape architects to develop a plan for making this a public park. And of course, graffiti writers were not into this idea. The graffiti is all about transgression and anonymity, and many of the graffiti writers have, been incarcerated for imbuing this beauty on the site. Many of the graffiti writers even have, day jobs and government names and monikers. And so even the idea of public engagement or engaging them became problematic. And so we actually pitched to the client that we would not have any public engagement, that our engagement would be not public. We would try to work to earn their trust one-on-one, And we met with them at bars, under freeway passes. We had representatives sent to us. We had anonymous emails and phone calls. And we cultivated strong relationships with a few of them and then really relied on them to also call on their networks. And so, you know, this is an image from one of the bars. We couldn't take any photos of any of the conversations. One of the first things they asked us when we had all these disparate conversations was, do you have to do anything? Like, can you just leave it? And when we, you know, in response to that, we said, look, if you do nothing here, in 25 years, the site will be inundated by high tides. Not even a storm event, nothing. So think of this project as a Save Graffiti Pier project. And that really mobilized folks to get involved. We asked everybody across these different conversations the same question. What is, if something has to happen, what is the best thing that could happen here? And what is the worst thing that could happen here? And we mapped the responses onto this graphic. And you can see the best thing that can happen is you don't touch it. And the worst thing that could happen is a new park, which, you know, as a landscape architect is really hard to hear, but we found a way forward. And that was that, you know, we found some kind of repeating themes, and we decided, you know, to go back to the graffiti writers and say, we think we heard you say this. If we do this, are we on the right path? And those four things were: ensure the continuation and expansion of art, keep the site vegetated and passive, make it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible, and keeping it gritty. And so, you know, we came back to them and said, here are the ways in which we're taking those four elements and really working the site design to accomplish those. So give you an example for this fourth one, keeping it gritty. I asked one of the graffiti writers when he said that, what does gritty mean? Like, describe it. And he said, plants and mud and water and rocks. And, you know, as he was describing it, it occurred to me that the ecosystem of graffiti really intersects with the ecosystem of the historic marsh on the site. And so we actually proposed removing the bulkheads and reintroducing an intertidal landscape. And what that would do is offer a kind of visual buffer for the graffiti writers on Pier 18 as basically the adjacent areas become condoized. There's a lot of development pressure encroaching on the site. We have water encroaching from the sea and development pressure coming from the land. And so the idea of buffer was really important. But it also allows a way for the park and its program to shift upland as the tides continue to rise. So here's where we landed after the concept phase. In the middle of the concept phase, we actually took some early renderings to the graffiti writers and had them tag on the renderings, their feedback. So we had to decode these tags and, you know, integrate their feedback into the development of the design. And we developed this custom suite of site furnishings in the language of the Jersey barriers that are on the site. Those big expansive surfaces, you know, are great as surfaces for making more art. In the middle of the concept phase, there was a global pandemic that started. And so we could no longer go to bars and, you know, meet them at random places. So we heard that the graffiti writers were making zines during this period. And so we made a zine with the graffiti writers called The Voices of Graffiti Pier. And they would go out to the site and tag the pier and send us the images. And we kind of integrated that into the same zine as the updated design drawings. And we would just give the graffiti writers that we knew personally a stack of them, and then they would distribute among their networks. We found the archival drawings of the original structure, and, you know, in our quest to make it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible, we really loved the existing railings, and so we wanted to figure out a way to bring them up to code. So this is a before and this is after, kind of a simple approach to this mesh that would bring it to code, but still keep it in the language of something that was always there. So this is before and this is after. We've basically kind of reinterpreted some of those invasive pioneering species into a bioswale. We're also really selective about the removal of invasives, really looking for ultimately what is friendly to its neighbors in this plant community, as opposed to kind of a more heavy-handed approach to removal. We also upgraded the surfacing to make it ADA accessible, proposing stabilized soil here. This is before and this is after. And what we've done is, these planting geometries that we have introduced are really about retracing what was already there and introducing a robust planting palette, but, with the character and condition of the plants that were already there. It is much harder to do this than it is to just come up with an idea and, impose it on the site, but really looking at what's there, what do people love about it, and trying to keep it looking and feeling like it was actually requires much more dexterity than coming up with your own idea and putting it there. This is before and this is after. Actually, recently we got some feedback that this still looks too pretty, so look out for an uglier version of this. But what we did was we kind of interpreted this shady pocket under the trestle into a shade garden, and you see some of our site furnishings and those railings and a new path. And so, yeah, this will not look like this in the next version. This is before and this is after. What you see here again is our reintroduced plant palette that's more robust and more resilient, some shade trees. Shade was something that they were looking for, and our site furnishings. In the first version of this rendering that we shared with them, we didn't have this coal here. This is remnant coal. And they said, no, look, going out to the site and coming home with coal all over your clothes is a big part of what we love about it. So we left the coal. Okay, so this is before, this is on top of the trestle. Right now, people are climbing up these chunks of concrete that are hanging off the threads of rebar. It's really dangerous, definitely not ADA accessible. But there's this incredible view of downtown Philly from up there. And they were like, okay, look, whatever you do up there, do not make it the High Line. So that was our goal, was to not make it the High Line. But we did want to make it ADA accessible. We did want to have seating. We did want to make it to code. And so what we did was we proposed cutting into the bed of the viaduct and introduce this ramp. The planting is all grasses and sedums, so nothing super lush. And then, the paths are gravel and stabilized soil. Even the seating is, these big, long chunks of concrete that, again, offer more surfaces for art. So looking at Pier 20, that pier that I said was falling into the water, we worked with Sherwood design engineers to work on shoring up this wall that had fallen. And we wanted to make the wall taller than the existing other wall, such that it could be another surface for art making, particularly as the tides rise. And so what you see here is that new, taller seawall integrated into the marsh planting. And so as the tides rise and this, falls further and further into the water, that'll be a kind of datum for people, and artists can engage in that dialogue. Okay, so Columbus, Indiana. Anybody familiar with Columbus, Indiana? Not Columbus, Ohio. 2 people. Okay, 3. Columbus, Indiana is a special place. It's a town of about 30,000 people in southern Indiana. J. Irwin Miller was the CEO of Cummins Engineering, a diesel engineering company. And he had this belief that he wanted to make Columbus, Indiana, the best place to live in America. And he felt like investing in the architecture of civic spaces could be a way to do that. And so this town, he created this architecture foundation that would fund the commissioning of architects from around the world. And so this town of 30,000 people has an incredible collection of modern architecture. So, everything from the fire station to the library, the churches, Saarinen and IMP. And Michael van Valkenburg was commissioned to make this park in 1993. So as a part of the legacy, they host a biennial, and they commission architects from around the world to design installations to engage in this legacy. And so we were commissioned to design an installation here at Millrace Park. And Michael van Valkenburg, was my professor, oddly enough. And so I called him and talked to him a little bit about the legacy. I was like, it's the 30-year anniversary, and it hadn't occurred to him. And so I really wanted it to function as a kind of celebration of the 30 years of the park and talk about the next 30 years or the next 300 years and beyond. in our research, we learned a lot about the tradition of the Ohio Hopewell Native people and this incredible legacy of mound building. For the Ohio Hopewell, the mounds were places of ritual and politicking and discourse, more so than in other traditions where they're more associated with burial. This is really the central place for ceremony and for gathering. And what we learned was that this form, I learned this in talking to Michael, this form that he had designed in the park was a nod to that tradition. In October of 22, we engaged the community to learn a little bit more about what their understanding of this in relationship to this park is. And we asked them a few questions, and we started to find a pattern in their responses. The hill came up a lot in people's recollections and memories of the park. So their favorite spot, apparently there's secret gin and tonics that the moms have at the hill. There's like all these incredible stories. Favorite spot in Millrace Park, we had this big map up and you see these pins all around the hill. But there's also this huge lawn, this huge field that's empty. And that was also pointed to a kind of space of opportunity for us. What is it that people love about this hill? And is there some kind of installation that helps us think about this huge, what they call festival field, as a space of opportunity for thinking about the future of the park? And people were interested in, when we asked them about the future of the Millrace Park, they wanted more program and activation. So this was really something that we could provoke. So we started to think about that complete circular form that's central to Native landscape legacies. So this was our first kind of study models about what would it look like to complete the circle. We were interested in the idea of completing the circle with something that was airy and you could walk through, and so it could be used. And the idea being that it would be an activated space. And we were thinking about frames as a way to frame past, present, and future. I was originally really obsessed with the precision of the form and the circle, and I wanted it to be in metal, but it's a pretty small budget. And so we realized quickly we could not do this in metal. And we started to think about bamboo. And it ended up being my favorite part of the project, to be able to build with this material. The growers of the bamboo came, they volunteered to come and build this with us and talk to the community about what working with bamboo means to them. And it ended up being really incredible, because it's not this mass-produced thing. There were real decisions that you had to make about where to cut, and you talk about it with somebody, and it's just this huge part of the whole thing. And the imprecision of it became my favorite part, this kind of dynamism to it. There is an official Columbus red, and so that's where the red is coming from. This is us mocking it up to scale, and then this is ultimately it in its built form. And you see now a little bit about the ways in which it's created a space in this no space in that big lawn. It's really it grew to have a life of its own. Watching it across the seasons has been my favorites. I don't think I put a winter image in here, but seeing it pop up through the snow is incredible. So when they have concerts out there, they actually, the VIP seating is inside of the form, and it's become the end. It became the end of the marathon, the Gay Pride Festival. They don't have a parade, but a festival was here. We worked with all of the big events that typically, happen in the park to design actually the spacing in between the bamboo posts to facilitate the widest range of events, but also still be something that could be enjoyed on a day-to-day basis. They have movie nights out there, and you kind of see how this really light form has such a huge impact in the landscape, really hugging folks in this space. This is no longer the back of the hill, but it's the center of the mound. And then do I have time for one more? I'll be quick. This is in upstate New York at Dia Beacon. Has anybody been to the museum at Dia Beacon? Literally nobody. Okay, well, one person? Okay. It was my favorite museum before I started designing it, so I definitely encourage you to go. I'll try to run through this kind of quickly. This is it's along the Hudson River, about an hour north of the city on the Metro North. In our conversations with Native people, a lot of folks reference this passage or this phrase, "We're all just passing through." And the idea is that in Western tradition, people name landscape features after people, but in the Native tradition, they name people after landscape features, and that is because we are all just passing through. The landscape persists. I'm going to skip through this for the sake of time. In our historical research, we found that the site actually of the museum, the 32 acres, used to sit in the floodplain of the Hudson River. And as a function of that, it really expressed a lot of ecological vulnerability that became clear to them a little bit later in their history. In the 1960s, when the environmental movement was really starting to cook here in the United States, Dia Art Foundation was formed as a kind of counter institution, and they funded a lot of early chapters of the land art movement in the United States. So things like Nancy Holt's sun tunnels and Spiral Jetty and Walter de Maria, the lightning field. So that was the kind of realm of their work. And they acquired this old Nabisco plant in 1998. And they hired Robert Irwin to design this really iconic landscape in the north of the building. And he also designed the building to retrofit it to become this museum. In 2012, that history of the museum as part of the historic floodplain became very apparent because during Hurricane Sandy, there was a lot of flooding. There was flooding in the basement. It was almost catastrophic for the museum, and it really clarified their vulnerability. 2020 and the murder of George Floyd also, was a moment in time for this museum who, like many institutions, took the opportunity at the time to question the ways in which they were doing things. And for this institution, it really became about grappling with Indigenous land legacies. And so we were commissioned in 2021 to think about the southern 8 acres of the site, which was in this condition. Robert Irwin, in his design of the landscape and of the gallery spaces, had an idea he called conditional architecture. And he kind of fashioned both the landscape and the gallery spaces around this idea of a grid. On this drawing and the following drawings, north is to the left. The idea of the grid for him did a few things. It echoed the river, the railroad, the movement from New York City to Beacon, but it also presented for him an idea about egalitarianism and a kind of equality across spaces and across the galleries. And so everything is structured along this north-south. The thing is, the Native people actually had an east-west relationship to the river. The river was central to their way of life. It wasn't a highway. It wasn't, a place of extracting materials. It wasn't something you move along. It was something you move across. It's something you're trying to get to because it's so central to your life. And part of that tradition was a tradition of portage. So when the rivers were low, when the waters were low, people would cross seasonally across the river. And that would open up opportunities for exchange with different groups, access to different geographies, technology transfers with new people. And the Dia Beacon site was a place of portage for Native people. So east-west. And so this is the concept sketch that got us moving in a certain direction. The idea was to surface that legacy of moving east to west through a series of landforms. And in that way, we're also protecting the building from water. We're inviting water back to the site. We're not hiding the water. We're not trying to get rid of it. We're inviting it into the site through these series of basins, making it a part of the experience of the site. And we've also kind of bent Robert Irwin's north-south grid into an east-west. And that takes me back to the Toni Morrison quote when she says, floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding, it is remembering. So what we're doing is remembering the water on the site. This is a point I like to make to students. All these presentations make design process look like A, B, C. This was chaos. was a very circular process, but in the end, I get to present it in 5 minutes. So it's important that you know that. But we're working with clay and trying to explore these kind of a kind of sculptural form to those basins. And we worked with Sherwood design engineers to calibrate those volumes to the projected flood elevations. So this is the existing condition, and what you can see is just how vulnerable the building is to flooding. And this is with our form, and you can see how both the large forms, but also these micro topographies are also holding and expressing water, not just hiding it, not trying to get rid of it, but making it part of the experience. We worked with Larry Weiner Associates, who are meadow specialists, and we developed a whole palette of different mixes using over 90 species of meadow plants. So this is kind of the different mixes that we developed with them. A really robust planting palette in terms of tree canopy, largely native, but not all native. Landscape by the numbers, we converted 95% of the lawn to this native meadow landscape. At a certain point, the native people, when we presented some of our site analysis to them, they said, we don't want to see another historic map. Like, do not show us any more maps. You have to question who made them and why. And all of the history that you're trying to tell us about is in the ground. Just go look at the ground. And that really changed a lot of things for me. Landscape, in my opinion, history cannot be erased. Ultimately, it can be obscured, and people can try to erase it. But the landscape, the ground, is this recorder of time and of history. So we went back to the site and found all the kind of remnants of the brick and the rail and all of these things. This was a drawing that somebody, Allison Duke in my office made of her kind of new approach to site analysis. And this is a series of sketches of materials that she found on the site, and a new kind of historical analysis, and that actually ended up feeding our material palette. And we decided any material that we were using on the site would be something we found on the site, which is very hard to do. This is ultimately what's in construction right now. This is, just a really rigorous translation of all of those ideas and drawings into a set of construction documents. So this is the before, and this is after. You get a sense of how the different mixes express different levels of moisture in the landscape, and how the folds really invite you to journey through the landscape. Seasonality and this native mix of plants really expresses a lot of change in time. And the expression of seasonality is a huge invitation to bring people back throughout the year and across, the moments of their lives. We have a small portion of lawn still remaining, really to help support some of the programs of the museum that they want to happen outdoors. This is the top of one of the berms, and you get prospect out to the basins on either side. This is really kind of a social promenade up here, how we're envisioning it. And then in the lower basins, you get this more exuberant wet meadow. So the character of all of this is really apparent through the plants. And while, those forms are really sculptural, and we're talking about all this cultural history, this is an engineering project. An engineer could have done this project. This is about protection of the building. I think that's kind of what's exciting about where landscape architecture could go, because it's not just about saving buildings and, trying to protect these institutions and buildings, but it's really also what can it say, what can it do, what can it feel like, and what else can it perform, both ecologically and infrastructurally. So, there's a small water detention capacity really to just optimize the use of the lawn, but this is protecting from flooding beyond a 500-year storm event. There's a lot going on here that we worked closely with the engineers to accomplish. And so you can see then when water does appear on the site, the sculptural form that it takes, just a fun fact, when it crosses this path, that's actually the same elevation that the flooding during Hurricane Sandy was. So we'll always know when we've reached that point. This was just in December. Construction is paused right now because there's snow on the ground, but this was in December. We were still doing CA. So you can see some of those big forms starting to emerge. Even the small ones, small kind of folds emerging. and this will open in the spring. Thank you very much. Sure.
So thank you for the lecture. I know your work, I'm familiar with your work, but I feel like every time I hear you lecture, I learn something new or have new questions. The first question maybe relates to all of the projects. And it strikes me that your practice finds a balance between preserving or honoring cultural history, and then pushing forward with some sort of innovative design. How do you reconcile these sometimes competing forces?
Yeah, it's my favorite part. I think it is really central to my thinking. Yes, I feel like there's a latent genius embedded in a lot of traditions and cultures that aren't really embedded in the core of, haven't historically been embedded in the core. Is this thing on? Okay. Of design practice. And I always felt very limited as a student in learning about the history of landscape architecture and ultimately how it's taught and practiced. And so, I've almost become obsessed with thinking about challenging the conventions of how to do things, not just theoretically, but in real practice and built work. And what does that offer? What does that lend itself to? What innovations are there? And it's not like they've never been done before. People have been doing these things for thousands of years, but finding ways to introduce them into contemporary life, I think could help us tackle some of the biggest challenges that we have.
Building on that, indigenous forms of knowledge production don't always subscribe to or abide by Western notions of knowledge production. Can you speak a little bit more about how that informs the process of your work as well as the final product? I mean, I think we see with the Valongo Wharf that it's informing what the end product is. Does that show up in the process and inform how you approach the project?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I start really with the place, and which is a simple premise that maybe is pretty basic to landscape architecture. Like, what is the site? And if you think about the site as more than just the kind of physical conditions inside your the line that you've been given, if you really don't think about it as a closed loop system, but really think about it at a bigger scale and the systems that it's working within, and then you think about it in its depth, not just the surface, but really to its core, even in geomorphological time, like in the Valongo project, then it opens up all of these other ways of knowing and making, like you're referencing. But if I take landscape architecture as a basic premise, which is site design, I can start there and still end up doing these things.
Turn my mic on. Yes, thank you for a wonderful lecture. It's so inspiring to see such interesting and thoughtful work in terms of really getting us to think about sites, I think, in a much broader, more interesting way. The map that you showed where the continents are connected and how you then bridge this space that we take for granted now is really quite an extraordinary project. And, I try to tell students here, there's an agricultural district to the south called Redland, and it's got clay soil. And I say, well, the soil is from Africa. It doesn't, it was because the continents were connected, but also because of trade winds and hurricanes and so on. Thousands of years have deposited this soil here. So for architecture students to understand that sites are much more complex, much more deep, that have all of these layers of history and that are there to be uncovered and researched and interpreted is so rich. And so my question is, as a methodology, when you're dealing with your clients and you begin to engage this notion that on the surface, what they see may be only one aspect of what they're really looking at, that there's all these unseen aspects that the site contains. How do your clients usually respond to that? And is it a difficult process, or is it an easy one, or how does that work?
Well, we definitely lose some projects because of that, and we definitely win some projects because of that. It took me some time to gain the confidence to, when talking with a client who might ask, so what is this project going to be? And I have to look them in the face and say, I have no idea. And it took me a long time to really, because I know and I could say something, and I could just draw on, precedents and come up with something. But I know that if I and the client both believe in the process, we will end up with something way better and, than anything I could come up with in the moment. And I think we have to be honest about that as designers. I think we've fallen into the trap of selling ourselves as these geniuses that just show up and we can just smell the place and we know what it should be. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that for landscape architecture. So the Dia Beacon project, we competed with the top landscape architects in the field. And they all came in there with these extensive portfolios of built work, and they all presented what they think this is going to be. It'll probably be something like one of these. And we went in there and we were like, we don't have a clue, not a single idea. But what we do know is the process by which we will figure it out. The RFP originally was a trail. And I said I didn't want to do it. Every Monday morning, we go through, the whole office meets and we go through all of our RFPs and decide what we're going to do. And I said, I don't want to do a trail. And, there's a woman who's an art historian in our office. And she was like, you want to do a trail at Dia Beacon. And so we did it. And that's our trail project. So the director of the museum and I always talk about this because she reflects on the same moment where she just decided to trust the process, and they challenged us along the way. We challenged them. We had folks, other people come in the process and challenge us, and the project kept getting better and better and better. And so I'm very confident about selling that I don't know. But what I can tell you is that if you give me a chance to figure it out, it's going to be amazing.
I mean, on that note, could you assembled also a really great office? It seems like you have all these people from these different backgrounds, different skill sets, different training, different ways of forming ideas. And it seems like that would be a great virtue for meeting with clients, because the clients are also incredibly diverse, different points of view, different opinions. And rather than assembling a kind of monoculture in the office where you have 10 architects or 10 landscape architects, it sounds like your office is a really dynamic environment. Now, does that make it difficult internally to agree upon the direction of a project, or do you all sort of come to a consensus? I personally think it makes things better because we all understand that everybody's coming to the project with a different contribution, and we all kind of advocate, and myself included, and nobody is good at all of these things. But there is a kind of, a sense of empowerment that everybody kind of has a clear sense that, I'm really good at this and I'm going to advocate on behalf of that way of thinking. And so it's, all the puzzle pieces, the projects that do really well kind of get checked off by all of these different, people. And so I think it's really rich. In my professional experiences in the past, I always felt like there was kind of one prototype of professional. And if you check all these boxes, then you grow in the office. And it really didn't honor other ways of thinking and doing. And so I really wanted to challenge that and liberate that a little bit. I mean, we all have to it's a small office with big projects. And so everybody's got to produce at the end of the day.
So, but at the same time, we're engaging different parts of our minds, and I think the work really benefits from that.
Building off of that, have you, or has the trajectory of your practice always followed one that was interdisciplinary, or were you, I guess, is there a divide between what you were taught in academia versus how you ended up practicing?
Well, one thing I have found is that typically when you ask architects how they became architects, they always say that they started drawing houses when they were like 4 or 5. Is that everybody here? Yeah. Okay. If you ask the same question to landscape architects, it's usually a pretty roundabout way. And for me, it was very roundabout. So when Hurricane Katrina happened, I tried to actually declare for architecture, and then the registrar told me they don't have architecture. And I was like, okay, well, so then I did sociology, I did statistics, I did a master's of city planning. I just kept looking, but I basically read my way into design. It was through reading that I ended up in design, not because I was really aware of it, to be honest. And so I think I came to it with interdisciplinarity already on my mind. I also feel like not seeing myself in the history of the profession and in the curriculum. There was not a single Black person on a single syllabus during my 3 years of landscape architecture school, and nor a precedent, nothing. I was just not there. And so I had to go to other disciplines to find myself and bring, other ways of thinking into the work, because landscape architecture wasn't going to do that for me.
And do you have any advice for students or emerging designers who might have a desire to engage with interdisciplinary partnerships, but are struggling to figure out how to cultivate those?
Yeah. Okay, I usually make enemies out of architects when I say this, but I'm going to say it. I like to call architects building architects, because the fact that there's no qualifier word, and we have one, we have landscape architecture, suggests that we're a kind of subfield. And we are newer in the history of professions, but not at the core of it. The core of it, people have been, making homes and lives for, a long time. And so I do think that for us in working with architects, we often, are, told, like, here's the building, can you put things around it, but don't cover up the building, that kind of thing. And so, I hope one takeaway for you is to think about the land as being foundational, and not just the thing around the building. Whenever I have to explain what landscape architecture is, I'm like, we do everything except the buildings, it's the earth. And so thinking about the land as generative for your work, and subservient to the land, we're all just passing through, right? The land persists, especially in a climate and an ecological context like Miami, like South Florida, I think is incredibly important. So, interdisciplinary could go a lot of different ways. I think the relationship between architecture and landscape architecture is one that I think about a lot, because I'm always looking for ways to work with architects. But that kind of, seeing landscape architects as design partners and not just the people that do the thing around the thing, is, I think, important for us to kind of make progress on some important aspects of our practice.
It's funny that you say that you make enemies out of architects saying that, because my entire practice, and I'm not the only architect thinking like this, is such that buildings fall to the backdrop of architecture. And just, I guess, referencing the bell hooks books that you put up there earlier, Out on My Mind, she references architecture as a cultural practice and something that's much more than just the building itself.
Yeah.
And so it's refreshing to hear that in the discourse as well. I was just saying that it's refreshing to hear that architecture as a sort of backdrop, or architecture is bigger than just the building itself, but is much more of a cultural practice. And I referenced Bell Hook's Art on My Mind, where she speaks about architecture as a cultural practice.
Yeah, building off of that.
Building off of that.
Sorry, what would I say? Planting off of that. No, I completely understand what you're saying, and you know, the irony is all architecture is made of natural materials. It comes from the landscape. It's born from it. So the idea that somehow that there's this separation is a strange concept. But what I was going to say was your literary quotes at the beginning, you know, as your inspiration, I thought was also really wonderful because we talk about inspiration coming from past work or from the profession, but there's a great tradition in landscape with inspiration coming from literary, you know, sources. And I wanted to ask you, since architects talk about materials, you started talking about the materials of the landscape and the idea that, you know, that you build with the natural materials, and unlike architecture, which changes very slowly, the landscape changes dramatically season to season. Do you find that there's also a history and like an embedded history in materials, in the plant materials themselves? I mean, you talked about the baobab, you talked about the ficus. When I hear those trees, I start thinking about their histories and their movement, either natural or by people across the landscape. And it's a really fascinating question. So do you work with a particular palette of materials, or are you drawn to a certain palette, and how is that maybe affect the interpretation of the work in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that it is really, I really do see plants as cultural vessels. You know, one thing that the Brazil project really made apparent to me was the learning about all those plants that were brought to the Americas by Africans. I mean, those plants are considered non-native, and you're not allowed to actually plant those in public landscapes. But you know, our understanding of what's native and non-native is based on which plants were in the Americas when the Europeans arrived, which is, you know, an arbitrary moment in the constant migration of plants and humans. And so we actually showed those maps to the city government, and they relaxed that policy for us. I mean, there was some treatment and stuff that we had to do in terms of containing some of the roots, but, you know, I think challenging some of our embedded notions of like the value of certain kinds of plants and why is really critical for me. You know, landscape, I think, is really into its own history and precedent, and uses it self-referential in terms of, okay, a border is supposed to look like this, and you use these plants, and, you know, and it's just ripe for throwing it all away and thinking more expansively about plants. I think our ecological challenges also are pointing us in that direction and forcing us in that direction. But to also understand these plants as cultural vessels in the midst of all of those other challenges is really important to me. And plants are one of those things that, I mean, I was just reading this book by Judith Carney, who is a botanist, and she was talking about kitchens as the botanic gardens of the dispossessed, and how important, you know, the plants that we eat have been in terms of kind of, you know, plants as cultural vessels ultimately. So it's an important part of my practice. And when you don't have the memorials, when you don't have the books affirming your history, when you don't have all of that, then, you know, yeah, your kitchen is your botanic garden. Your, you know, memorial is a dance that you do in the street. You know, it's, so and that's landscape. All of those things are landscape. It's public space. It's what you grow. It's what you eat. And so landscape has been our built environment, you know, this whole time.
I don't know how we're doing with time, but should we ask for questions from the audience? Is there anybody who would like? Yes. I'll bring the mic up there. No, here you go. Thank you.
Sarah, hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I may have perceived the last bit of what you said about the plants and stuff like that as you being a bully.
Ooh.
Because you're not an architect per se, right? You are, but you're not. And that architecture are like flowers, right? You throw them away. Maybe that's what I got from you.
Whoa.
But that's not my question or leading to my question. My question is more about like, I got a sense of like you love the history of things and you beaming through like hundreds of years of history to the point where you're like, hey, to the console and you're like, hey, you need to look at these maps, but it's like in 30 years, like, hey, that's very important too. Because I found that in my own research, in my own thesis when I did the Times Square. And I found a movie where they did the whole evolution of Times Square from a swampland to what it is now, a Hollywood movie. And I thought that was so radical. In like 30 seconds, you see the whole history, like from Hollywood. Question, did you find, I like the Brazil project a lot. I didn't know that most of the Africans came through. My blood is from Colombia. So we had a lot of Africans come to Colombia as well. But did you find that because like, I don't know, millions of years ago, Pangaea, the whole thing in like, there was Brazil's part of like Africa, right? The tectonic shapes, that there is traces. And maybe that is a reason why, because there's that sort of trace in history, that they would go through there, like a channel or.
Yeah, it's ocean currents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a richer channel to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's been really important to the notion of resilience, cultural and ecological. So the elders talk about how, when they saw morning gourd on the coastline, these were signals that no matter what happens here, we will persist, we will survive because this ecology is ours. And so that became the source of so much strength. And to this day, a lot of those rituals that are tied to those plants form the core of ritual and joy and resilience and understanding about that history. But yes, traces in every sense of the term, geologic traces, the soil, the plants, the people, the culture, it's all there. And actually, there are some, ethnic groups in West Africa that send people to Brazil to learn about some of those plants, to learn about their own ecology, because they've been colonized too in the intervening 500 years. And so, which one's the source and which one's the receiver it's all mixed up. And they're the same place ultimately, but there's an ocean in the middle.
I think we have time for one more question. So.
About your comments about using non-native plants, just a word of caution. Florida was ruined by non-native plants. Back in the 20s, they wanted to drain the swamp. So Melaleuca, ficus that you mentioned, were removed. Now you look around Coral Gables, you don't see what Coral Gables was completely covered with, which was date pine.
Yeah.
So the danger with going with non-natives is you can wipe out the native tree population. And I really think it's important to look at what nature wanted to put there.
Yeah.
And with very few, try to limit how much you differ from what nature wanted to do.
You're referring to invasive species.
Right.
Not non-native.
And the fact you mentioned ficus was terrible for South Florida. It might work in other places where it truly is native, but the distinction is about its invasive qualities versus whether it's native, right? And so what is it actually doing and how is it performing? If it is invasive, that is the distinction I'm making. Instead of, I think people tend to
use non-native to mean invasive. They are not the same thing. So yes, I mean, ultimately the balance of a diverse and functioning ecosystem is what we're after. And if a plant is invasive, then that's a different distinction.
I was just going to add to that. We have like 35,000 different varieties of orchids in South Florida, none of which, for the most part, are native, but they're not invasive. And so they're everywhere and people love them. And there's now this Million Orchid campaign to bring back native orchids into the landscape. But we have, you brought up a point in your talk too about how climate change is changing that picture too. Things that were further south are now moving north with climate change as we heat up. And again, that drawing that you show of the continents connected, the former head of Fairchild Tropical Garden, Bill Klein, uses that as the discussion about native versus exotic and invasives. He said, you know, the continents were all connected at one time. This is a arbitrary and a notion of, you know, what belongs where. Yeah. And we need to start changing our thinking on that. But thank you so much for your talk tonight. It was wonderful and very inspiring.
Yeah.